Hello. Well, I'm going to be talking today about perhaps the greatest security challenge facing the United States today. The ongoing confrontation with North Korea over its nuclear and ballistic missile program. In doing so, I'm going to introduce a historical sensibility. And I'm going to encourage you to rethink some things that are really fundamentally understood by most people who work on Korea policy. And that is that China wields enormous influence, political influence, over North Korea, and that China can solve the North Korea problem. North Korea has made, in recent years, major advances in their nuclear and ballistic missile technology, to the point where very soon they may be able to deliver to the United States, to the continental United States, a nuclear tipped ICBM, or intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, I don't believe that they will. They're not suicidal. But perhaps that's the subject for another TED Talk. But we need to understand that because the United States does not deal well with uncertainty, we need to take steps that will prevent North Korea from demonstrating the ability to do this, to do something that only two other countries that are not allied with the United States, Russia and China, presently have the ability to do. And that is, again, we deliver a nuclear warhead to the continental United States. During the presidential election, nearly every candidate from both parties made statements suggesting that China could and should rein in North Korea, or make North Korea behave. Since his election, President Trump has suggested that China has the ability to rein in North Korea with just the flip of a switch. These statements really, in many ways, overestimate Pyongyang's docility toward China. And in many ways, they reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between China and North Korea. But this kind of thinking is not new. In fact, this kind of thinking has been around in U.S. foreign policy for at least 4 decades. Back during the Carter administration, folks in the national security team came to the understanding that really there was no intrinsic value. That was a quote, no intrinsic value to dealing directly with the North Koreans. What could we trade with them after? So instead, they concluded that we could rely on China. We were just normalizing relations with China at this time to deal with the North Koreans. We just had no interest in talking with them. 4 decades later, this has remained essentially the default U.S. policy toward North Korea. Over the years that I've been studying Korea, I've asked many people in the foreign policy community in Washington why they think China and North Korea are so close, or why they believe China and North Korea are so close, and why do they believe that China has the ability to exercise political influence over North Korea. And the answer that I get most often is that, well, the Chinese helped North Korea during the Korean War 65 years ago. They prevented North Korea from being wiped off the face of the earth. To be sure, the official propaganda of both China and North Korea suggests that the alliance is strong. They both say, for example, that the alliance is, quote, forged in blood, unquote, or it is, quote, as close as lips and teeth, unquote. This latter statement suggesting or implying an intimacy that is really unusual in international relations. But a lot has happened in the 65 years since the Korean War. And we now know from the diplomatic documents of North Korea's former communist allies, these materials that I spent a decade obtaining, that there is a profound sense of mistrust at the basis of the relationship between China and North Korea. Diplomatic cables produced in Pyongyang, records of conversations between North Korean officials and other communist leaders describe how the North Koreans have long perceived Chinese actions toward North Korea to be overly interventionist, less than respectful of Korean sovereignty, and at times a betrayal of communist principles. Tensions between North Korea and China go back decades. In fact, we can trace them back to the Korean War. Remember, this is the instance where most policy people working on Korea suggest that the relationship became close. We have evidence that shows that the North Koreans were extremely troubled by the fact that you had a foreign military apparatus coming in and taking over control of field operations when the Chinese People's Volunteers entered the Korean War in the late fall of 1950. There were serious disagreements between Chinese and North Korean generals over field tactics. Tensions remain long after the Korean War armistice in 1953. In 1956, China's top leaders directly interfered in a domestic political dispute in North Korea. Not only that, they also supported and indeed provided asylum to critics of North Korea's founding leader, Kim Il-sung. Decades later, the North Koreans would continue to talk about it. They clearly perceived this as a violation of North Korean political sovereignty. Perhaps the greatest stumbling block for the relationship, however, was in the 1960s, during the Chinese Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. During this time, Chinese Red Guards openly denounced Kim Il-sung and called for his removal, called for him to be overthrown. Chinese troops entered North Korean territory and occupied town. There were clashes between the North Korean and Chinese military on their border in the vicinity of Paektu Mountain. The North Koreans never got over this. The relationship was never recovered. And again, decades later, the North Koreans continued, as we can see from materials we have available to us, continued to view the Chinese leadership with suspicion. In the mid-1970s, as China grew closer to the United States and began to integrate into the global economy, the North Koreans looked at the Chinese and thought that they were betraying their revolutionary principles, and by adopting capitalist practices, were betraying the North Koreans as well. In 1980, Chinese newspapers openly criticized the North Koreans for choosing Kim Jong-il, the son of founder Kim Il-sung, as the successor. Now, it had been the prerogative of the Chinese emperor to confer legitimacy on a Korean monarch up through the late 19th century. But for the Koreans, the understanding that China felt it could express an opinion on who would be the leader in 1980 was unconscionable. Again, they clearly perceived this as a violation of their sovereignty. Perhaps the greatest betrayal, however, came in 1992, when China normalized relations with the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Because of these episodes, there exists today a profound sense of mistrust in the relationship between China and North Korea. And this profound sense of mistrust reduces China's ability to exercise at will political influence over North Korea. In fact, if we ask China, like the US has been doing, to exercise political influence, we are asking them to do precisely what North Korea has most resented over the past nearly 7 decades. This is only going to backfire. It's only going to antagonize North Korea more and exacerbate the situation on the Korean Peninsula. That said, it is true that China today has enormous material leverage over North Korea. Some 90% of North Korea's foreign trade is with China. Beijing also provides crucial aid to the North Korean regime. But there are limits to the effectiveness of material leverage in changing the policies of aid recipient countries. One only needs to think of the United States' relationship with South Korea in the 1950s. Despite being utterly dependent on the US for economic and security assistance, South Korean President Syngman Rhee was able to openly flout US pressure. He understood that ultimately the United States needed him as a security ally in the region. And the US understood that it couldn't push him too far. It couldn't risk destabilizing the vulnerable South Korean regime at the time. China's in the same boat today. Despite having material leverage over North Korea, it is not willing or able to use that to push North Korea to abandon its nuclear program today. Why? Well, it's not in China's interest. It's too risky. Now, some argue that if you do push North Korea too far, as the United States wants it to, then it's going to lead to state and societal collapse in North Korea. The United States is urging China to bring North Korea to its knee, and it's using economic sanctions and other pressures to force North Korean leadership to understand that the cost of maintaining a nuclear and ballistic missile program is just too great. Again, it's urging China to use whatever material leverage it has to bring North Korea to its knees to abandon that. But the Chinese leadership is concerned that it will lead to instability that could potentially lead to state and societal collapse in North Korea. China doesn't want this for a couple of reasons. Some speculate that it's because they fear the possibility of a sudden flow of refugees across the border. I don't put a whole lot of faith in that. I don't think that's the main reason. Ultimately, the Chinese government, the Chinese economy could absorb a flow of refugees from North Korea. Though there is perhaps a related consequence, and that is the potential for Korean irredentism. There is a large population of ethnic Koreans living in Northeast China. And as even Mao Zedong recognized, Northeast China was at one point part of Korean territory. But I think the major reason that the Chinese leadership today is afraid or doesn't want state collapse in North Korea is because it would mean national reunification on the Korean Peninsula under a Seoul-based regime. And as much as China does not want a nuclear North Korea, even more than that, they don't want a unified Korean state that is a treaty ally of the United States at their doorstep. Especially as China is trying to reassert a traditional regional hegemony, trying to establish a zone of deference in its neighborhood. Sorry, the clicker's not cooperating. There we go. So there are clear limits to what China can and is willing to do, because it's not in their interest to comply with US wishes and bring North Korea to its. So what can we do? What can be done? Ultimately, I think the United States is going to have to sit down and talk with North Korea. This will be uncomfortable. It will be very, very challenging. But the United States is the justification, or the existential threat posed by the United States is the justification that North Korea uses for their program. So we'll need to sit down, talk with them, try, however possible, to overcome mistrust on both sides. Because if we don't, if we continue to try to outsource this program, or this problem rather, to China, we are essentially acquiescing to North Korea continuing to develop their ballistic and nuclear missile and nuclear technology. Thank you.